Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We welcome you once again to the airwaves of Salam Media. It is Wednesday night, it is 7 p.m. and it is a time of the week where we bring you Wednesday nights with myself, Inayet Wadee, and wonderful being in the company of our listeners, our viewers at Salam Media. We welcome you to the show on this Wednesday evening, and it is the 25th of May. Now, why is the 25th of May so significant? We are talking about Africa Day, which is normally celebrated on the 25th of May. And we tend sometimes to focus on many global issues, on issues right across the entire world. And the major issues, we know the major talking point of late has been Ukraine, and also looking at some of the other areas, the hotspots around the world. We look at the Middle East, we look at Yemen, we look at what has taken place in Asia, Southeast Asia, and right across the entire world. But somehow, for some reason or the other, there doesn't seem to be much of a focus on what is taking place in Africa. In fact, when one looks at Africa and when one looks at the problems around the world, when one compares what is taking place in Ukraine at this point in time, the concern about the refugees, the concern about the war, about the killing, about people dying, yet we have a continent where for decades we've been beset with problems. There's been so many issues, yet often it is referred to as a dark continent, but it is a continent that is rich. It is wealthy in resources, and also comes with an ugly history of colonialism. When the colonizers had basically left, they left this country, they left the continent in somewhat of a mess as well. And that is why this panel discussion in the light of Africa Day today, we are going to be joined by Dr. Gwinyai Taruvinga, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Johannesburg's Africa-China Studies Center. And we also have got Kekeletso, Khena, Deputy President of AZAPO. Unfortunately, independent Africa analyst Ayesha Kajee could not join us. We are led to believe that she's a bit ill, so we do wish her well. But right now, we welcome both our guests this evening, Dr. Gwinyai and Kekeletso Khena. We welcome both of you to the show. Wonderful that you're able to join us on Wednesday nights with myself, Inayet Wadee, this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Gwinyai, just to start with you, and obviously looking at Africa Day, the significance of this day, while it is celebrated by many, do we really appreciate the significance of this day? And more importantly, what does the African continent mean to us and to the rest of the world?
I think, firstly, thank you very much for having me this evening. Firstly, I just wanted to say that just going back to how you started off this program, you outlined that from a global perspective, one of the things we see is that there's a lot of discussion about what's going on globally. So this could be the war in Ukraine, as you rightfully mentioned, or what's happening in Palestine, for example. There's also a lot of discussion concerning what's happening in America with the current shooting that happened a few days ago. And not much is said about the African continent. So from that point of view, the African continent and commemorating Africa Day then becomes very significant, because as you've also rightfully stated, you spoke about how our continent is littered with a really disturbing history of colonialism, and how that has had an impact on the post-colonial state. So when we talk about colonialism, I think it's linked to Africa Day, and this is a very important discussion, because as the African continent, more needs to be done, not only to shed light on the importance of Africa Day, but to have a platform to discuss the challenges and also discuss the opportunities that we have on the African continent. So I think it is very important that we have discussions on Africa Day and exactly what it means for the African continent, especially stemming from the colonial history that you spoke about, because that essentially has a huge impact on our current state as a continent at the moment.
Well, certainly is. And I also just like Kekeletso, and I just like your thoughts on the significance of this day and what it actually means to you what it means to AZAPO? What does it actually mean for us as Africans?
I think, thank you so much for having me. And I really want to apologize to the viewers for not having live ESCOM happened to us. So in trying to talk about what African Union and the 25th of May actually means, I think for us, they represent a dream. They represent a future. They represent where we are supposed to unfortunately be, but we are not. We know that the formation of the African Union was really to look at, unifying Africa, to look at solving some of its challenges, but also to provide a formidable force against our oppressors and colonizers, and to find a way for us to self-empower and to self-determine. We know for a fact that over the years, we have not been able to do that. Our colonial masters continue to have a firm hold on our economies and our countries, as well as our minerals. And however, it is important to note that the African Union does provide a vehicle from which we can start clawing back our minerals, our wealth, and to start finding solutions, our own solutions, to the problems that continue to plague our nations. And I think it's quite important to stress that the majority of our problems are not problems that we have created ourselves as Africans, but they are problems that are created for us by people who are dependent on our poverty. The poverty in Africa is critical to maintain the status quo in the rest of the world. And as a AZAPO, we look at this day to be able to show to provide a spotlight on what's happening in the country, but also an opportunity for us to reflect as Africans in totality on where we are and where we should be going. We know that when Kwame Nkrumah spoke about the African Union, he spoke literally, when he spoke about unity, he spoke about why having one currency and having one army would change the future of the continent, and how we know that the forces of the West and now the East are ensuring that we never get to the point where we can work together and be united, because the reality of the situation is that if that were ever to happen, we would be a self-determining continent, and the people who are dependent on our minerals, the people whose wealth is grown at the back of the suffering of our people, would not be able to do so.
Well, certainly. In fact, and you know what, you've made so many points, and I think each point is worth discussing, Kekeletso and Dr. Gwinyai. Kekeletso spoke about a dream and a future. And obviously, looking at the African continent, that dream has not materialized. In fact, to a large extent, it's actually become a nightmare for the African continent and the people of Africa, considering Kekeletso talking about issues like poverty, saying that, these problems are not created by us. These problems were created for us. And the world seems to thrive on the problems of Africa.
Yes, indeed. So just to also add to what Kekeletso has just spoken about, when she talks about the African dream, it's more of a dream deferred. So we often talk about this famous phrase within the African continent, that not yet uhuru, basically meaning we're not yet there yet. So when we talk of Kwame Nkrumah and everything he spoke about concerning today, AfricaDay, and obviously what we wanted as a continent, we still haven't reached that potential yet. So potential in terms of maybe using our natural resources, potential in terms of using our human resources as well. So we find that that dream is indeed deferred. But I think an important point that we also need to realize is this notion that we have struggles that are as a result of our history, and I think this is true, because if we look at colonialism and how it happened with the Berlin Conference in 1884, where Otto von Bismarck sat down with his colleagues from different parts of Europe, and they decided to to divide the African continent amongst themselves, this was probably the genesis of all our problems, because we inherited borders that were not ours, we inherited institutions that were not ours, and in many cases, again, I always go back to the point that some of the current challenges that we face in terms of making use of our natural resources and using those natural resources to build our economies are mainly, the challenge around that is mainly because of these institutions, which were mainly extractive, and we inherited this from our colonial past, and this still continues to have an impact. And again, this sets us up, we're basically at the back end of development when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world. So again, this goes back to, I think, the point that Kekeletso just raised there, Kekeletso, sorry, which was that most of these problems are indeed an inheritance of our colonial past, and this inheritance continues to affect us presently.
Well, certainly. And also, I think, Kekeletso, while we are talking about the African Union, are we talking about the leadership, the African leadership that is represented in the African Union? And when one looks at the leaders of the past, and we've had great African leaders in the form of people like Jomo Kenyatta, Patrice Lumumba, we've had Julius Nyerere, our very own Nelson Mandela, and there are so many that we can speak about that had this vision, that has a dream for Africa, for African leadership, and for African leadership to make its mark, to play its role on a global stage. And for some reason or the other, that hasn't happened. And all these great leaders, what they stood for in terms of their principles and what their vision was for the African continent, that hasn't materialized. And again, one needs to look at the crop of leadership that we have in Africa, in the African Union, and on the continent as a whole, Kekeletso.
I couldn't agree with you more. We have what we might call a leadership vacuum, and over the years we have seen people crop up as illegitimate leaders. For starters, we've seen a number of coups happen in the continent. We've seen a number of micro wars that have taken place in the continent, and the kind of leaders that emerge from there seem to be very problematic. But let's go back to the African Union itself and its current leadership. If you look at where we are, globally, in terms of global politics are really about resource control. And if you look at the focus of the West on Africa, everybody is looking at us as literally, this is where you go and get your resources to grow your country. And we know from books like Economic Assassin that our leaders are pre-chosen at this point. We know for a fact that there are very specific processes, and plans that take place where people decide who must run what country because it is important for them to be able to access resources. We know for a fact that the international community doesn't trade with Africa from a fair perspective. They do so wanting to pay as little as possible for our resources. And subsequently, they aid the corrupted leaders that we already have. So I'm not saying that, people should not take responsibility for their actions, but we must also understand that for corruption to happen, there is the corrupted and there is the corrupter. And we are so quick to look at our own African leaders without really looking at the full picture and saying, who is corrupting our leaders? Who is coming in here and taking our resources for as little as possible, ensuring that there are arms that destabilize our countries so that they can continue building their own countries. But even in saying that, it is critical for us to also, on this particular day, throw a spotlight at the fact that we are not producing the kind of leaders that we want to have. Even here at home, we know that we have a leadership vacuum. You look at the type of leaders that we are producing, we look at the nature and the content of leadership that we are producing, and you know that if this is the trend, we know that the continent is in trouble. So we need to be developing leaders that are forthright. We need to be developing leaders that do not have the scarcity mentality. I think there's a need for us to go back to African ways of being. And African ways of being are very, very simple. I am because you are. The process, the concept of Ubuntu speaks to my wellness linked to your own wellness, and it's not about individualism. And so we need to go back, even our leaders need to understand that the scarcity mentality is a mentality that we inherited as a continent. We had enough. We were not born slaves. We were not born criminal. We were not born thieves with greed. We had enough, and we lived together with enough, and we shared what we had. And so we kind of need to inculcate our own values, or remember our own values and our ways of being as we develop leadership. We need people-centered leadership that looks into the future to say, okay, we know that we've got resources. Is that all that we have to offer? How do we use technology today to be able to develop and create opportunities for young people in this country? We know for a fact that we have a massive brain drain. A lot of Africans are leaving this continent again now, by their own choice to go and develop these countries and to develop technologies in those countries. And again, it speaks to that leadership vacuum where we are not able to identify our own talent and groom it so that it can work for our people.
Yes, and also I think Dr. Gwinyai, just following up from what Kekeletso is saying and talking about the leadership crisis, the leadership vacuum within the African continent. And we know our problems did not go away when the colonizers had basically left the African continent. In fact, they've replaced it with economic imperialism, I would say even economic sabotage to a large extent. And some of the problems that we are talking about, well, we're talking about military coups. We're talking about the problems where we find brother pitted against brother when one looks at the trouble spots right across the continent. When one looks at countries like Sudan, for instance, we know what has been taking place in Somalia, Ethiopia, and right across the entire continent. It's basically virgin territory for conflict, for strife, for mayhem, for chaos, for killing, for merciless brutality as well. And that has been the trend for a very, very long time. Now we know for the fact that this is not something that Africa needed. This is not what Africa wanted, but there definitely have been outside forces that have been having a major role in all this chaos that we're speaking about.
Yes, indeed. But I think everything within the African continent, as we analyze it and as we try to understand our continent, it always goes back to strong and bold leadership. Just to add on to what Kekeletso was saying, to say that we've often seen that on the African continent, we've had major power vacuums. And these power vacuums obviously have manifested into, for example, the military coups that you've spoken about. But even within understanding military coups within the African continent, we see that these military coups in many cases are as a result of foreign countries interfering within our affairs. So for example, if you look at a few of the strong leaders that we've had on the African continent, such as Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, such as Patrice Lumumba in the DRC, we see that in those countries, military interventions were led by external forces such as the French, and these had a massive impact on these particular countries in mention, such as Burkina Faso and the DRC. But in terms of leadership, we find that there is indeed a gap in leadership. Hence, we see some of the challenges that we face on the African continent. But in addition to that leadership, I think we should also be looking at the type of institutions that we have in our African countries. So these institutions, for example, our executives, our judiciary, our legislatures, these are important institutions within our countries. And the ability for these institutions to be independent is extremely important for the development of the African continent. Because when we talk of natural resources, or when we talk of leadership vacuums, etc., I think it is important for us to also analyze the types of institutions that we have within our African countries, because at the end of the day, these institutions are, as a result, we see how natural resources do not benefit the country. We can always take that back to extractive institutions that again go back to our colonial predecessors who had built institutions that were meant to extract, meant to exploit, and these are the same systems we're still using today. And adding to that, we find that the global community again has used these power vacuums to abuse our resources, and we find that we have difficulty in actually using those resources to benefit our country. So if we're going to look up at theories such as the resource curse, mainly these theories go back to how the African continent has extractive institutions, and I think if we can address institutions as well as leadership, then the African continent will have a better chance of being independent, a better chance of actually providing for its citizenry, which I think should be at the heart of institutions such as the AU and all those other institutions as well.
Well, clearly at this point in time, we are not independent because we have outside forces that determine what a destiny or what shape and form the destiny of Africa should take, Kekeletso. And sometimes, as you mentioned, we are our worst enemies. But when one looks at the continent in itself, and let us just focus a bit for a few minutes on the problems that the continent is faced with. And we see it here in South Africa as well. We've seen xenophobia manifest itself, as Dr. Gwinyai mentioned, spoke about the military coup, the foreign interference. And throughout all this, we still see the scramble for Africa. The Chinese want to be here. The Americans want to be here. The Europeans are here. In fact, there is the scramble for Africa, and it has been for a very, very long time, because we know that when one looks at Europe, Europe doesn't even possess any of the resources that Africa has at this point in time. Mm-hmm. We know there is a huge Chinese interest. And at the end of the day, one of the key concerns is selling off the African continent to those who have vested interest or who want to have vested interest in the continent.
I'm so glad that you raised, Dr. Gwinyai raised this issue of independence. I want to go there first before I address other issues. The African Union itself as a body has a dependence on the European Union. We know that at this point, as in today, over 70% of the funding that keeps the African Union going comes from the European Union. That, for me, says whoever pays for it owns it. And that's where we need to start worrying around who is actually paying for our own politics. But then you then speak of the issue of xenophobia and these borders that we inherited. See, the thing about colonialism is how the oppressed people simply take and imbibe the oppressor's ways of doing things. Steve Biko speaks about the mind of the oppressed being a very valuable weapon in the hands of the oppressor. And we know that colonialism came and literally attacked our minds, because how is it that they came in 1884 and divided Africa up and separated us and made us fight with each other so that they could control us? And we come back a few years later, after all of the independence, we come back and we say, oh, actually what you did was good. Now we're going to keep your separation. We're going to keep these borders, and now we're going to fight over these borders so that you can have even better control of our resources. That speaks to our own problem. In South Africa, for instance, we know that there's a vigilante group that is going around hurting people and saying that these people are responsible for the poverty and the crime, etc., etc. Earlier, I spoke about we always look at who is the corrupter. No, we never look at who is corrupting the situation. We know for a fact in South Africa, for instance, if you look at people who claim that Zamazamas are stealing platinum, that certain people are stealing copper, that certain people are stealing our railways, where is that stuff going? We know that stuff gets on a ship and it leaves the country to then be developed. So it leaves so that it's a raw material, and it's a processed raw material that is easier for them to convert into goods. So we know that it is foreign capital that is driving the crime in the country, that unfortunately wears the face of a Black person. And it is very unfortunate that we direct our anger towards the wrong person. And this is all part of the plan. If they can have us fighting with each other, we are much further from the united vision of a one Africa with one economy and one army that can stand to self-determine in the world. So it's not by mistake that we find ourselves with these problems. But over and above that, it is critical. You know, it doesn't take much to destabilize a country. And you can see that there's a very focused approach to wanting to destabilize our country. And they're going to use us and our brothers to fight each other so that we can destabilize each other, destabilize the country, so that they can continue to do what they're doing in the Congo, for instance. So I just think it's so important on days like this to see what is happening in the continent, to reflect and to look at what is the big picture. Who is benefiting from us fighting each other? And at the end of it, you will find that there is foreign capital that benefits from the misery of Africans. We know for a fact that the US is highly dependent on Africa. Let's look, for instance, at Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola, about 25% of Coca-Cola's sales in global sales come from this continent, 25%. They have an interest in this country, and they're not the only one. They sell their computers here. They sell their resources here. They sell so much. We've got Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Who are the biggest users? So we're a big market for them. Of course, there's going to be a scramble. But the problem is, do we even know that we are being mined? Our data is being mined for the benefit of the Americans. It's not just our resources now. It's our resources, it's our data. Do we have leadership that is even aware of the level of digital enslavement that we are finding ourselves? Are we even thinking along those lines?
Well, certainly, and I think you raise a very, very important point when you speak about digital enslavement. And again, when one looks at the continent, the continent has never ever been short, Doc, of skills, of expertise, of leadership. And also, when one looks at the continent as a whole, it has got a rich history. When one looks at the multiculturalism, when one looks at also the diversity that exists on the continent, and unity in diversity, which is basically what we are actually calling for. Yes, we've got these we've got these man-made borders that we speak about that separate us. But at the end of the day, when one talks about culture, when one talks about the rich cultural history of this continent, I don't think there are many other continents that can compete with the African continent in that regard.
Yes, indeed. And I think one of the other issues as well that to add on to what Kekeletso has just said is the issue of education on our continent. So we find that in many cases we are very, in our schools, we are taught about colonial history and then post-colonial history. Little has been done to teach us about pre-colonial history, because there was life on the African continent before colonialism. Or you have to just look at the pyramids in Egypt, for example, that show you that there was life before colonialism. You need to look at the Great Zimbabwe to show that there was life before colonialism. You need to look at Timbuktu in Senegal as well to see that there was life before colonialism. So I think if we can maybe address that as well, so that at least our African continent is aware of the fact that there was life before colonialism, that could go a long way in terms of speaking about unity and everything that comes that comes to mind in terms of unifying our African continent. But another important element I think that we also need to look at is this notion of decolonization. Kekeletso raised a very important point stemming from Steve Biko and how colonialism had an impact on the mind. I think Fanon also wrote a lot about colonialism and how it affected the mind. And I think these are some of the issues we need to be looking at to say when we talk of decolonization, it's not merely renaming the names of our buildings at universities, or renaming the streets in our roads, for example. It is more of the mind. It is more of educating our children in high school and primary school about the African continent, where it came from and where we want to take it. And again, when we take it back to leadership, I think you raised in one of your questions, you spoke about xenophobia within the South African context. And what we're seeing from that mainly is that it is almost a failure in government in terms of providing for the citizens. For example, in South Africa, there's a 35% unemployment rate the last time I checked. And a lot of graduates are leaving university. They were given a promise that, look, if you go to university, you're most likely to get employed, but that's not happening. And that is causing a lot of frustration. We see a lot of power vacuums that then, cleavages rather, that then develop from that. And then that's when we see groups like Operation Tudula come into the fore. And then in West Africa, when military coups happen, it's the same scenario. There's a power vacuum. The government might be failing to provide from an economic standpoint, and this could lead to a situation where things are degenerating in a country, and then people obviously will protest, or the army will then decide to intervene. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make is that the notion of leadership is extremely important, but also understanding our history so that we know where we are coming from, and at least we then have direction as to where we want to go. Because our leaders, in many cases, have failed to direct us as to where we want to go. Hence, we start speaking a lot about our history, because although we have that history, it's not really clear where our leaders are trying to take us. And I think this is the challenge that we have on the African continent as well.
Well, it's certainly the challenge. And also, I think when we talk about history and knowing our history, and I'm not too sure whether Kekeletso is still with us, because I don't see her come up on the screen. I'm hoping, yes, okay, she's come up on the screen. We know very little, Kekeletso, about our history. And as Dr. Gwinyai mentioned, that our history is not only during the colonial era, it's a pre-colonial era. And when one looks at Africa, even going back, and I follow the religion of Islam, and when those that were oppressed well over 1,440 years ago, the first place they came to seek refuge was Africa. So a religion like Islam, which is one of the major religions around the world, came first to Africa before it went to any other part around the entire world. Now, that is how rich this continent is in terms of history, which is just one example. And I'm sure, Dr. Gwinyai, there are hundreds, there are thousands of other examples as well. And which tells me one thing, that when one looks at our education system, and even within the African continent, very little focus within the education system is given to African history, so that we can truly appreciate what this continent is all about, Kekeletso.
I couldn't agree with you. I think, you speak of a very important thing, which is religion. As an African, over the years, it's been interesting to discover how colonialism was framed and built around the colonial God, because we were taught as Africans that God was white, and that our aspirations must be for whiteness. And as a result, everything that we thought we knew, all things good that we had, we simply had to put away. I'll quickly just want to go back to the notion of African traditional medicine, for instance. We know that during apartheid, African healing practices were literally criminalized. So if you were ever seen going to go and consult an African healer, you would be arrested on the spot. And subsequently, our healing practices were then put under the lights and dimmed and hidden. And so our healing practices were therefore taken away. Over the years, though, what we have seen is how the West comes back to Africa and goes to rural areas like Limpopo and says to African traditional healers, what plants are you using to cure malaria? What are you doing for TB, etc., etc.? What then happens is that our knowledge and our plants are then taken out of this continent, and they're taken overseas to be reprocessed. We know for a fact that we are now fighting for a plant that is currently being used by Linktagon, the pelargonium. Pelargonium is an African plant, and we've been using it for the treatment of flu and chest diseases, etc., etc. That knowledge was stolen in South Africa. However, that pelargonium plant is currently not even being produced in this country. It's been propagated in Germany, and so there is no beneficiation of Black people or the knowledge holders. We know for a fact that our healing practices, as well as our medicinal and scientific discoveries, get stolen and used without beneficiating our people. So it goes to show that we have a history of knowledge. We know science, we know healing. If you go, for instance, into history, you will see that we were the first ones to understand human anatomy. There is records of in Egypt of us having dissected a human and literally knew where what set and how it actually worked. So we taught the world that. However, we are taught that everything that is scientific, everything that is healing must come from the West in order for it to work. So it's important that we reverse that kind of teaching so that people, Black people, and in particular people from the continent, understand the power that they hold in their genes, because knowledge has an intergenerational transfer through the DNA. So we need to know who we are so that we can unlock the knowledge that will be passed on by just accessing that thing that says, I'm an African, I come from greatness, I come from knowledge, I come from ancient people who ran, who lived, who traded, who developed, who gave the world the science that they know today. That will give young people a sense of pride and a way into approaching the future from a place of power.
Yes, Dr. Gwinyai, essentially what Kekeletso is saying is we have the knowledge, we have the power, we're just not tapping in to what we have. And we've got gold basically on this continent.
Yes, indeed. I think I want to add on to what Kekeletso was saying. And I think one of the points you also raised can be linked to what in academic space is called indigenous knowledge. And a lot of research has shown that even in the past, we're currently having debates on climate change and sort of predicting rain patterns. In the past, our ancestors and people from the previous generation had the ability to predict when the rain was going to fall, and this would then influence how they would then plant crops, when to do it and how to do it, based on how they knew how the rain was going to fall. And currently, we're having discussions on climate change, yet in the past, our ancestors had already started this research, and most of them had already kept records of different rain patterns from as far back as the early 19th century. So tapping into this information, I think, is extremely important. But more importantly, I think I always take it back to the notion of decolonization, to say, what is the content that we are teaching in schools? Because in universities, when we, for example, talk about democracy, we use examples from the first world to talk about first past the post or parliamentary systems, for example. We mainly use American examples. So for first past the post, we use the UK for parliamentary representation, yet in proportional representation rather, but yet we have examples from the African continent that we could use, and we don't do this. And we find that there is this notion that when we adopt Western ways of doing things, things work better. And this is not true, because the African continent has for a long time been able to do things by ourselves. And I think it goes back again to the education system. What are we teaching our children in school? What are we teaching university students? And I think it goes back again to decolonization, and now decolonization has to do more with the information, with the content that we're giving children, as opposed to naming buildings and roads.
Well, certainly. And also, Kekeletso, when one looks at the impression that the outside world, those that are outside of the African continent, have of Africa, they're not armed with sufficient knowledge. In fact, they know very little about the African continent because it is not an area that they focus on. It's not something that the outside world talks about. When one looks at, for instance, even the major media outlets, when you're looking at the likes of CNN, and suddenly when they show the African continent or where the advert is being played, and you'll see a few African kids and with poverty, looking undernourished. You see flies hovering all about them. And this is the impression. This is the impression that even the mainstream media in the West and Europe is creating of the African continent. And this gives us even more reason to showcase the continent and obviously, firstly, to get our house in order, but more importantly, to prove to the rest of the world that we are not what you think who we are.
See, we've allowed the rest of the world to define us, and I think that's where the problem is that we have allowed them to define us. We have allowed them to tell us who we are. Make no mistake, media has a reason for portraying us in the manner that they portray us. They portray us in the manner that they portray us because, one, if they can continue to hide the fact that the cool drink that the American child drinks that is made from a can comes from, is being mined by children. If they can show the world that the cell phone and the laptop that they are using, the key components come from minerals that are mined by poor children in the continent, then it might just change the consumption patterns. It might just change the way people think about us. Media, the role of certain media, and in particular your CNNs, they are propaganda machinery. It is critical that they continue to drive the narrative of a poor Africa that holds a begging bowl, because this idea of a begging bowl Africa creates the dependency we have. We know for a fact that we are being kept indebted because it is this indebtedness that continues the control the international community has on the African continent. So it is critical that we look as though we are starving. We look as though we are not the developers of technology. We look as though we are not the providers of the resources, because if that were to change, the great economies would collapse. The poverty of Africa is critical to keep the West comfortable. These people live on the backs of our pain. It lives on the backs of the blood and the sweat of children in the Congo. We must understand that that is not the visual that they want the world to see. They want the world to see America as a savior. They want us to see Britain as the nice post-colonial friend to Africa, where the truth of the matter is that we know that even the system we have in South Africa was designed long before the meetings that happened in the 1990s. They literally took our people, our leaders, to London to have pre-discussions that would ensure that the colonialist rule and colonialist benefits from our minds will continue. Why is it that we find ourselves today, for instance, South Africa, our economy is not growing, and yet we have minerals that leave our country every single day. We have companies that declare profits to their international investors and leave absolutely nothing for our country to build from. These are systems that were developed long before 1994 actually even happened. It's just a continuation. So it's critical for them to make us think that we are dependent on them, when we all know is that the whole world, including China, is dependent on Africa.
Well, certainly, and I think you raise a very, very important point, and I'd like Dr. Gwinyai's comment on the economic system and what we inherit in terms of their systems, their ideology, their economic philosophy. And I know one of the criticisms that has been leveled against a country like South Africa, for example, is we've become even more capitalist than the capitalist countries themselves. And that is the extent to which we have basically embraced these systems.
Yes, most certainly. And I think those systems again go back to the process of ending colonialism. So in many countries, after the end of colonialism, what happened is most of colonialism came to an end through a negotiated process. I think we saw this with CODESA in South Africa, and we saw this with the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979 in Zimbabwe, and I think it was similar to Kenya as well when they gained independence. These countries were then born out of a negotiated process, and we all understand that within a negotiation, you give up certain things. And within the South African context, certain things were given up to ensure that there was peace and stability after the end of apartheid. And the same thing happened in a country like Zimbabwe, whereby the negotiated settlement resulted in land reform not taking place immediately after independence. The point I'm trying to make there is that issues like colonialism and apartheid did not come to an end because those who were perpetrating them realized it was bad. The only reason they stopped was simply because it was no longer sustainable within the global community and they had to shift. And I think this is something that we need to take into consideration when trying to understand our post-colonial state. So within South Africa, for example, if you look at World Bank reports, one of the things they argue is that South Africa has the largest gap between the rich and the poor, and this gap continues to grow. We see this with COVID-19 that exacerbated this, and this gap continues to grow, and the economy is not growing, as Kekeletso just pointed out. So I think it's important, again, that we take it back to the leadership again. What is the vision of our leaders? Because we talk of natural resources, we talk of all these things that we possess on the African continent, but nothing comes out of it in many cases. And I think we really need to have a real look at our institutions as well as the leaders that we have in our countries, because they don't give us a clear vision as to where we are going. Hence, you raised that point where you said that a country like South Africa has become more capitalist than the capitalists themselves. This, I think, is an indictment of the leaders to say that you can't promise certain things concerning job creation, etc., but you fail to do it. And this then just continues the cycle of poverty that we continue to see in our countries.
Yes, and also Kekeletso, together with the cycle of poverty that Dr. Gwinyai speaks about, also when one looks at food insecurity and how this has basically contributed, and I know we're still in the COVID era, but we've seen so much on the African continent over the years. We've seen Ebola, we've seen AIDS, and to the extent that even when it came to Ebola, the French sent in their military to come and fight Ebola instead of sending doctors. Now, what does that actually tell you? That, in anything that the colonizers do and those that have an interest in the continent, there is an agenda that is playing out. When we see what is taking place north of Mozambique at this point in time, and it's taking, and for a very, very long time, there is definitely a scramble for those resources. But what you find with the mainstream media, it's about ISIS, it's about terror. It is we see what's happening in the Tigray region, and the entire world at this point in time still focus only on Ukraine because Africans don't have blonde hair and they don't have blue eyes.
It's said that black and brown bodies have no value. I think the most painful thing was watching this Russia-Ukraine situation roll out. I spoke earlier, right, when we first started about the micro wars that have been happening in the continent and the number of people who have died in the continent. And I don't remember seeing as many pictures on CNN. I don't remember seeing as much attention being posed onto those countries. I never, there's very little information available online about the war that's currently taking place in the CAR or in Darfur or what's happening around Mozambique. This is because black and brown bodies are dying. We know for a fact that America went and killed people, and nobody talks about those black and brown people that they killed, all looking for weapons of mass destructions that never really existed. Nobody calls them to order. However, there's a massive focus because blonde and blue-eyed people have suddenly decided, a small tribe of blonde and blonde and blue-eyed people decided to fight each other. And now we must care. Now our petrol prices must increase. Now we must have issues of food security. And by the way, the issues around food security are man-made. It is important that we understand that we are poverty is intentionally created in this continent. We have land, we have access to indigenous processes of farming. And all of those were destroyed. We know for a fact that when Monsanto came here, they are poisoning our soil, they are poisoning our seeds so that they become the owners of how we produce food. We know that food production is a political thing. And at the moment, Monsanto and its other subsidiary farmers are driving that unfortunate agenda. And we are sitting by and not doing anything about that. So I think it's quite important that as we address the issues of resources, we also pay attention to who is dying, and we will then get our answer. Black and brown bodies don't matter. They never have. And it's going to be up to us to make the death of black and brown bodies count. But more importantly, to say to the world that it is not right for you to fund the wars in the continent. For instance, when are we asking the question of why we have U.S. Army bases in Africa? Why does Botswana host an army base? Why does Kenya own a U.S. Army base? Why do they need to be here with their armies? Why are we seen as a threat? What is it about us that is a threat to U.S. that they must have bases in this continent? When are we going to ask that question?
Well, certainly, and I think these questions are absolutely important, very, very necessary. And as you mentioned, in terms of even food insecurity on the continent, just one country on the continent, Sudan, for example, can be the breadbasket for the entire African continent. And that is the potential that the African continent and Sudan, a country like Sudan, has as well. Now, Dr. Gwinyai, I see we've got, obviously, this has been such an interesting discussion, I must say, that, time has actually flown, and we've got about 8 minutes, and we will continue, obviously, right until 8. Just looking at Africa and finding our own solutions. And the reason why I am raising this issue is we know that there have been leaders that have been looking at an African solutions to Africans' problems. One of them, Muammar Gaddafi, we know at one point in time spoke about the African currency as well and moving away from the US dollar. We know what had happened to him. He was basically taken out. So, this is what I'm saying is we need people to stand up, to be counted, leadership to be counted as well, and say, as Africans, how are we going to address our problem? We will find solutions. We don't need you. We don't need the outside world to assist us in solving our problems.
Yes, indeed. And I think from that point you've just raised there, I think unity is extremely important on the African continent. And unfortunately, because of the history of colonialism, we lack that unity as a continent. And I think this lack of unity is one of the things affecting the growth of the African continent. So when we read on the African continent, we see that we have almost all the natural resources that we need to stand alone, for example, by ourselves without being assisted by the rest of the world. So, for example, if we decided to isolate the African continent by itself today, would be able to survive because we do have all the resources that are required to do that. But one of the challenges that we see on the African continent is that there's a lack of unity from all the regions. And if you look at this lack of unity, in many cases, it will fall along the lines of who colonized who. So, for example, the British colonized certain parts of Africa, the Belgians, French, and so forth. And that has caused an element of disunity. Hence, we see that their military bases, Americans have built military bases, yeah. So if someone was to do that, the idea is that if we are unified as a continent, those certain things wouldn't occur. And this also goes back to the point you raised about Muammar Gaddafi. And one of the things he spoke about was the United States of Africa. on paper, it was a very good idea, but in terms of implementation, we need a lot of unity for those type of things to work. And as we all know, colonialism was very good at using divide and rule, and this still affects our African continent, and that is something we need to address in order for us to go forward. We need that unity to withstand what the global community is trying to do and to withstand how the global community views the African continent.
Well, clearly, and also this divide and rule policy, Kekeletso, and we see evidence of it. We see how Sudan was split up into South and North Sudan. We see what is happening in Libya at this point in time, where there are major problems in the north and the south of Libya as well, the power struggles that are taking place. And this is basically another form. The divide and rule policy has been there all the time. We knew it was there during the time of the British as well. We know what has happened in South Africa and how this had basically contributed to us being such a polarized nation on this in this country as well. But just coming back to the question of solutions, and in your mind, in your analysis, Kekeletso, what are some of the issues we should be thinking about as far as solutions go?
So yes, unity is key, but I still think the challenge we have in Africa is what we call political apathy. People are tired of the struggle. People are politically tired. People are not engaging with the issues. People are not holding their leaders accountable because people are tired. There needs to be a movement where we go back to conscientize people of the issues. The revolution is not going to be run by 100 top leaders that come and have these amazing intellectual conversations. What we need is a groundswell of young people, of communities that are saying, this is completely unacceptable. This is not how we want this continent to be run. This is how we want this continent to be run. We need active, engaged citizens. And this requires us to go back into communities and do the hard work of conscientizing our communities of the fact that we have not arrived at liberation. It is not yet Uhuru. We need to go back and get our people involved in politics again, and involved in changing their own circumstances, because we have what it takes. We need to teach young people design thinking. How do we solve our own problems? You have a water problem. What is that water problem? What resources do you need to solve that problem? And innovate around the problems that exist in your community so that, yes, you can monetize them, but also you are solving your own problems. And we're not waiting for China and America to solve our problems, but that is going to take deep community engagement rather than us politicking at high levels like in the manner that we are doing right now.
Yes, we've got about 2 minutes, and Dr. Gwinyai, just to wrap up, and just some final thoughts from you.
Well, look, I think more discussions like this are extremely important for our continent, because I think dialogue, I think, is a very important aspect that we need to continuously have on our African continent. And more important, I think this issue of holding our leaders accountable, I think, is important. And we need our institutions such as our SADCs, our ECOWASs. We need our institutions such as the African Union to be able to assist the citizenry in holding leaders accountable. I mean, for the longest time, our African continent has been littered with controversial elections that the AU has rubber-stamped. We need that to stop, and we need our leaders to be held accountable. And the only way to do this is if we have strong institutions that adhere to democratic principles. And also, just finally, I know a lot of negative things are said about the African continent, but I'm an optimist, and I'm always hopeful that our continent will continue to grow. It might take time, but I think eventually we'll get there if we continuously work on this process. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for being a Gunners fan. In fact, I'm just looking at the flag in the background as well. I'm a Gunner too. Kekeletso, final thoughts from you.
Thank you so much for having me. I think final thoughts, I will agree with Dr. Gwinyai that this continent is the future. We are literally the future for the entire world. And it's important for us to rise and take our rightful place in terms of respect, in terms of our ability to grow our economies, and in terms of our ability to show the world that we are able to take care of ourselves, and that we are not constantly going to be issuing out a begging bowl. So I think it's about time that we take our rightful place and do what is right for our people. We can do what is right for our people. And greed and poverty are not really, the ways of Africans. And we just need to find ourselves. Ubuntu is key. I am because you are. And when we remember that we are because we are collective, I'm sure we can find our way there.
Well, Dr. Gwinyai, Taruvinga, and also Kekeletso, Khena, I want to thank both of you as being part of the panel discussion this evening. It's been most absorbing. It's been very, very inspiring, very, very interesting. And there's just so much that we have unpacked. And as you mentioned, we need to have a lot more discussions like these. And hopefully we will be having them here with you and other panelists on Salam Media. But for now, once again, I appreciate you taking time out. All the best to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of Wednesday Nights with myself, Inayet Wadee, focusing on Africa Day, today being the 25th of May, while Africa is celebrating this day, as we have unpacked. It certainly is no easy ride for the people on the African continent against the background of colonialism and so many of the other issues that we have been talking about. And we trust and hope that you have found it interesting, as I have actually, and totally absorbed in the discussion tonight with our panelists. And with that, I'm going to be signing off once again. It's been great being in your company from myself and the team. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.